Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to start and finish Vietnam with the remainder of the class sessions that we have, which is only 3. So this is a little unprecedented to do the Vietnam War in only 3 lessons. So I'm going to keep the vocab short and sweet, and we're going to have, you've just taken your pre-quiz now. So you've taken your pre-quiz and we've gone over it live. So now I'm going to give you the background in this first Screencastify of our debacle in Vietnam. So remember, this is during the Cold War. 1964 is a pivotal year, but we are involved in Vietnam since the 40s and especially in the 50s. So it's really hard to put dates on this war, but we go from aid to actual intervention in 64. So we're going to count that as the official starting. And then, as you can see down here, we are going to withdraw from Vietnam in 73. So then we'll talk about that after, and then there will be maps. So don't worry if it's confusing. But from your pre-quiz, you already have sort of a sense of where Vietnam is. All right. So the facts are we are in the midst of the Cold War, and China we know has fallen in 49, and something interesting happens in Vietnam. In 1954, that require us to get involved. Because we are afraid of what's called the domino effect in Southeast Asia. So it relates to containment because, of course, everything in our foreign policy during the Cold War relates to containment. We're trying to contain communism. We failed to contain communism in China, which is just above Vietnam. And now communism is once again threatening somewhere in Southeast Asia, and we are afraid if Vietnam falls, then Laos, Cambodia, Bangladesh, all of those countries in Southeast Asia will fall like a domino. So the domino effect is our new commitment or renewed and stronger commitment to containment. So just like we were committed to containment in Korea and succeeded, we started where we ended on the 38th parallel. We are now committed to containment and prevention of the domino effect in Vietnam. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So in 1945, the Japanese leave because they lost World War II. So we see that the Japanese were there. Now, the history of Vietnam is so much more than just this. They were occupied by the Chinese at a certain point, and then, as you know, they were occupied by the French for the most recent 200 years prior to the 20th century or mid-20th century. So in 1946, the French moved back in Vietnam. So I believe I've told you before, or alluded to the fact that after World War II, England gave up its empire. India became independent. All of the sun finally was setting on the British Empire, is the saying. And the French decided that they were going to go back and recolonize Vietnam, mainly for the resources. I always call them the 2 R's, the rice and the rubber. And the French decided they're going to continue their legacy of imperialism. So this blows my mind on many fronts, considering they were occupied in /Vichy during World War II, and the fact that everyone else was giving up their empires. Obviously, we gave the Philippines independence. It was just everyone was doing it, and the French want to go back and recolonize Vietnam. So I blame the French for Vietnam, partially. And again, I think it was a pretty bold move considering their lack of stellar performance in World War II. So, some kudos to the Free French, but really they weren't doing much. So in 1954, French actually lose to the Vietnamese, which is, of course, hugely not surprising. If not surprising, again, knowing the French forces weren't that strong, but it's very surprising to the Western world that the West lost to, an Asian army. This whole racism thing and yada yada yada. Western bias and things. So French lost. So now we're really afraid of this domino effect. And we had, of course, backed the French with supplies and things like that. So the Geneva Accords say that Vietnam will be temporarily divided on the 17th parallel, the 17th parallel, and then in 2 years, to give everyone time to settle down, in 2 years, there'll be free elections. So in 1956, the elections were blocked. The free elections were blocked. So now we need to do a little vocab. So when Vietnam was divided on the 17th parallel, there's a little bit of a civil struggle going on in Vietnam that will become a full-on civil war. And that's basically what we're involved in. We're involved in a civil war in another country. So the north of the 17th parallel was run by the communists under a man called Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh goes way back to Versailles. He was the one, from your quiz, who approached Truman at Versailles and asked the U.S. for help for self-determination. And Truman was busy, and he said, I never heard of this place, Vietnam, or I'm not interested right now. Go away, and I have bigger fish to fry here, and ignores Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh later goes to the Russians, and they're happy to support him, and the communists rather. And so he says the best way to unite my people is under communism. End of story. So Ho Chi Minh, who is a nationalist first, becomes a communist because we basically blow him off at Versailles, and the Russians don't blow him off. So the North is communist, much like Korea, and the South is Western. Democratic, not so sure. Free, not so sure. But they are on the side of democracy. Remember, so now the South is led by a man called Diem. Okay, so that's the South. So if we're looking at this from a Western point of view, the North are the communists and the bad guys. The South are the Western and good guys. So now, Diem, remember, all right, so just a little sidebar here. Sorry to do this, but a little sidebar here is think of the South Vietnam kind of like our West. It's where many immigrants came in. Remember, like the land rush and things like that, and people from all over kind of came in and moved to the West. So it's a little more of a hodgepodge. It's a little less traditional. So when the French came in, it was easier to control the South because of that, and that's where the Western influence was. And that the capital of the West was Saigon, and the North was more traditional. It's kind of like our East. We had our more traditional. We were established longer, and the capital is Hanoi, and that's where Ho Chi Minh, the traditionalist, the nationalist, that's where mostly people were Buddhist. There was less French influence, so less Catholicism, less Western ideas, less capitalism, even, if you will, just more traditional. So just kind of keep that in mind. So we're going to have a more populated. The North, just like the North Vietnam, just like our East, is way more populated than the South. So keep that in mind. So if there were to be free elections in 1956, it would have hands down gone to the communists. Hands down, the North would have won because that's the most populated area, and they're more traditional, and they saw Ho Chi Minh as their true and undivided leader, as did many people even in the South, because this Diem guy, even though he's Asian in looks, he wears a Western suit, he speaks French, he's Catholic. The Vietnamese speak traditional language of Vietnam is Vietnamese. The traditional religion we know from our quiz is Buddhism. So Diem is not a traditional Vietnamese. And there are some people obviously in the South who are traditional too. So if these elections had happened, hands down, North would have won. So what Diem does is he refuses to hold the elections. So there are no free elections in Vietnam per Geneva Accords. Okay, who's the good guy? What side are we on? So right away, it gets very, very confusing. So we are now full on giving aid to the South Vietnam Army, and there are no elections, and it's a divided country. So hence the Civil War. So now people in the South are very upset that there were no elections, obviously. There's a divided country. It's on the 17th parallel. There's a North and a South Vietnam because the elections never happened to unify the nation. Okay. So we continue to give aid. And then it really looks like America needs to intervene to really contain this area because, again, it looks like the communists could possibly win. So we get involved. this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And there's a whole story behind that. We're not going to go into that right now because I want to kind of get through this. But basically, there was some firing in the Gulf of Tonkin, alleged firing on U.S. ships. And that was our instigation for war. This is under President Johnson. So the way we get into Vietnam, it's a resolution. He gives this resolution to Congress, asking for military aid. So technically, this is the resolution. Congress doesn't actually declare war, but they do vote on this resolution. So Congress does support and fund the war. And then not 3 years later, the war protests begin in earnest. Then in 1968, two really insignificant things happen. In Vietnam, there's the Tet Offensive and the My Lai Massacre. And we have to table that for now because in the U.S., Nixon becomes president. Johnson, due to complications from Vietnam, does not run again in 68. So remember, Johnson is president when Kennedy dies, is assassinated in office, and he only serves out that term. He does not run again in 68. So, I'm sorry, that's not true. Johnson serves out the rest of Kennedy's term, runs in 64 on his own, and then can run in 68 because it wouldn't be the 10 years, and he chooses not to run in 68 because of the war. So Nixon gets elected, and the protests, again, continue in the U.S., and they're asking for the Vietnamization of the war. In other words, let the Vietnamese fight their own civil war. We have no business there. And then some very famous things happen. We'll go into this later. Invasion of Cambodia and Kent State and Jackson State riots. And in 1971, there's the trial of Lieutenant Calley, which goes back to the My Lai Massacre. And the Pentagon Papers are revealed. Christmas bombings. 1973, America withdraws from Vietnam. Okay, so this is the important. So the war ends. We end in 1973, and in 1975, North Vietnamese take over Saigon, and the American embassy is evacuated, and Vietnam is reunited as a communist nation. So at the end of all this, we do not have containment. We have failed in our goal of containment, but this should not surprise you now. We failed with containment in China. We failed with containment in the Western Hemisphere with Cuba when Castro took over in 1959. And now we're going to fail to contain communism in Vietnam because we withdraw, and 2 years later, North Vietnamese completely overrun Saigon and reunite Vietnam. So this is our epic fail because we were involved militarily and we did withdraw. And we did not maintain our objective of containment of communism. It was not a draw like it was in Korea. It was an abject failure from a political standpoint. Now, people will argue that militarily we didn't lose because we withdrew. Congress withdrew money and troops, but we did not achieve our objective. And so this is the failure of Vietnam. Whether it was a military failure or not, I really don't care because politically we didn't meet our objective. And let's face it, war is extremely political. And what it did to our country at home, which we'll focus on next, shows what an abject failure and huge loss this war was. So that's what we're going to focus on now. So that is your first Screencastify.